What you are looking at right now is Taliban fighters inside the presidential palace. Taliban fighters placing their guns on the desks, sitting behind the desk of, we assume that is the desk of the Afghan president. A fairly stunning turnaround of events in Kabul. You started the day certainly with the news that the Taliban fighters were surrounding the city. Now they're inside the presidential palace.
What's left of a nation so torn, being played against each other from the day that we're born? What's left of a country stripped bare by greedy corporations and rapacious billionaires? What's left once the vultures are through? Will there even be a country left for me and you? What's left once the fantasy fades and there's nothing but reality to smack us in the face? What's left are a people in pain, abandoned by their government and struggling to maintain. What's left is a nation enraged, with more and more becoming disillusioned each day. I'm left, and I'm here to stay, to make you feel uncomfortable and show you a better way. I'm left, but I'm not alone. There's millions more just like me, and not one will they own. We're the left, and we won't be ignored. The masses have been ignited, so brace for the storm. I said we're left, and we won't be ignored. The masses are ignited, better brace for the storm.
After 20 long and costly years, the American-backed government that cost over $2 trillion and countless lives to prop up came crumbling down in a single day. I'm sure by now you've seen some of the dramatic images of the Taliban so quickly and easily taking control of Afghanistan, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, as well as most of the mainstream press and the president himself acting like this was some kind of unforeseen travesty. When anyone familiar with the actual situation on the ground, including Biden's own intelligence advisors, could tell you that this was the inevitable outcome, whether we left now, in 2010, 2015, or 2050. Don't get me wrong, I'm thrilled that our troops are finally out. But the hard truth is that we should never have been there in the first place. And despite the fact that Biden is acting like a full withdrawal was the plan all along, we know Biden was actually planning on leaving at least 650 troops behind, and was only forced to fully evacuate the military because the Afghan army did not actually want to fight a brutal and prolonged civil war. That was our bizarre pipe dream, not theirs. He was also planning on keeping thousands of mercenaries, contractors. A force that was actually beefing up its numbers as late as this past May, even as the military itself was getting ready to leave, which leads many to believe that Biden wasn't planning on ending the war at all, but merely further privatizing it, and fighting on with contractors, special forces, allies in the region, and intelligence operatives. And the new CIA director, William Burns, seems to support this hypothesis, telling the Senate Intelligence Committee in April that his agency would not be leaving and that, quote, the CIA will retain a suite of capabilities, which is fitting seeing as they were the first Americans to invade the country shortly after September 11, 2001, though we were active in the geopolitically crucial region way before then. To get an accurate understanding of Afghanistan and how our relationship with the region actually fostered the rise of both Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, we need to take a step back and start from the beginning. It all started in the late 70s at the height of the Cold War, when the former Soviet Union was helping to prop up the socialist government of Afghanistan. So, of course, the brave and noble Americans had to help the poor and helpless people of Afghanistan to stand up to the terrible scourge of communism. Though this rare article and its provocative pictures paint a strikingly different picture. We can clearly see women attending a political rally dressed in the modern clothes of the era, with no face coverings or male escorts visible. We see young Afghan men and women freely and happily walking about the streets of Kabul, as well as schools and apartment buildings comparable to what you would find in the West. The socialist government even had the stated goals of emancipating all women and young girls from their antiquated and brutal tribal bondage practices, as well as implementing equal rights for all minority groups and attempting to provide all of its citizens with education, adequate medical care, decent housing, and modern sanitation. Economic reforms such as canceling burdensome debt and installing price controls were also introduced, as well as worker co-ops, which were open to both men and women, for the first time putting the means of production and the wealth it produces into the hands of the workers themselves, enabling the perpetually poor peasants of Afghanistan to finally afford luxuries like healthcare and education for their children. Horrifying, I know. But no need to worry, the United States via Pakistan soon supplied the Mujahideen, the precursor to both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, with state-of-the-art Stinger missiles, munitions the terror group wasted no time in using against schools and other civilian targets. As Max Blumenthal details in his masterful unmasking of the war on terror known as The Management of Savagery, the brains behind this so-called Afghan trap was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. And the reason was simple: to undermine the US's biggest adversary at the time, the Soviet Union, with the hopeful aim of bogging the commies down in their very own Vietnam War, as Brzezinski outright stated in his initial letter to President Carter. It was also touched upon in the 1980s propaganda film Rambo 3, a personal favorite of mine as a child, a film that was even dedicated to, quote, the brave Mujahideen fighters of Afghanistan.
You know there won't be a victory. Every day your war machines lose ground to a bunch of poorly armed, poorly equipped freedom fighters. The fact is that you underestimated your competition. If you'd studied your history, you'd know that these people have never given up to anyone. They'd rather die than be slaves to an invading army. You can't defeat a people like that. We tried. We already had our Vietnam. Now you're going to have yours.
If only we could have remembered that lesson ourselves. Mujahideen is an ancient term referring to fighters and protectors of Islam, and is generally equivalent to the Crusaders of Christianity. In order to build this new jihadist coalition, the Pakistani intelligence agency known as ISI was used to pluck various radical Islamist extremist groups from obscurity and irrelevance to propel them to the front lines in the war on communism. The hill separating the two countries was perfect for training the radicals and staging their offensives. And all we had to do to solidify this unholy alliance was to look the other way as Pakistan built its nuclear bombs. But this being the height of the Cold War, we could hardly pass up the opportunity to drain our dreaded foe of valuable funds, resources, and lives. So in the early days of President Reagan's first term, Operation Cyclone was made official, and billions of dollars in state-of-the-art weapons, equipment, and training soon flooded the extremely poor country of Afghanistan. But don't just take my word for it. Here's former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton giving her summation of events.
We also have a history of kind of moving in and out of Pakistan. I mean, let's remember here, the people we are fighting today, we funded 20 years ago. And we did it because we were locked in this struggle with the Soviet Union. They invaded Afghanistan, and we did not want to see them control Central Asia. And we went to work. And it was President Reagan, in partnership with the Congress, led by Democrats, who said, you know what, sounds like a pretty good idea. Let's deal with the ISI and the Pakistani military, and let's go recruit these Mujahideen. And let's get some to come from Saudi Arabia and other places, importing their Wahhabi brand of Islam so that we can go beat the Soviet Union. And guess what? They retreated. They lost billions of dollars, and it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's a very strong argument, which is, it wasn't a bad investment to end the Soviet Union, but let's be careful what we sow, because we will harvest.
Yet another lesson we should have heeded, yet sadly have not. But back to the early 80s. One of the first major projects undertaken by the CIA was to build a complex system of tunnels to give the Mujahideen a safe haven inside the borders of Afghanistan from which to operate. To complete this vital task as quickly as possible, the CIA brought in an experienced contractor from Saudi Arabia named Osama bin Laden. Incidentally, these very same tunnels were later evaporated by the mother of all bombs during the Trump administration. But it wasn't just arms and military infrastructure that the money was used for. $51 million was used to gift the Mujahideen with propaganda disguised as textbooks. The terrorists used these to transform the schools in the rural areas into little more than jihadist indoctrination centers. The books encouraged Afghan children to gouge the eyes and amputate the legs of Soviet soldiers, and had math problems asking, if one group of Mujahideen attacks 50 Russian soldiers and 20 Russians are killed, how many Russians fled? I guess they weren't concerned with taking prisoners. But most of this money was going directly to the warlords who made up the Mujahideen, like the infamous Hekmatyar, who was notorious for murdering left-wing activists and for throwing acid in the faces of women trying to better themselves by receiving an education from the new universities in Kabul. Hekmatyar was also one of the dozen or so Mujahideen leaders invited to the White House to meet Ronald Reagan, as seen in this unbelievable photo taken at the time. Of course, none of this could ever happen if the mainstream press was not completely complicit and willing to disseminate the State Department's propaganda, without Dan Rather gleefully embedding himself with the Mujahideen, without glowing in mind-blowing puff pieces on Osama bin Laden, portraying the future architect behind the 9/11 attacks as a shy and humble freedom fighter. Ultimately, the Afghan trap worked to a T. The Soviet Union was chased from the country and on the brink of collapse. Plus, it was a huge boon to the arms industry, not only sending corporate earnings and stocks skyrocketing, but enabling the battlefield testing and demonstration of the latest instruments of death. So what if U.S. intervention just so happened to completely undo the gains the people had only so recently made? For the Afghanis, this was a battle between the modernizing reforms of the young and progressive who seeked equality and a better way of life for everyone, and the antiquated and repressive religious patriarchy that dominated the rural countryside and despised the thought of sending their daughters to school. But the religious fundamentalists no longer need to worry, because any hope of their fledgling yet prosperous socialist experiment had been thoroughly crushed by the Mujahideen and their benefactors, the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, turning the nation into utter chaos and forever altering the course of the country. A country that was now in the hands of a few competing and well-armed Islamic extremist groups. What could possibly go wrong? As the Mujahideen devolved into various factions, including Al-Qaeda, the United States was deciding on who their newest primary proxy in the pivotal region was going to be. The ex-Mujahideen fighters would also go on to form the Taliban and later ISIS. But the main two forces in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet collapse were that of former Reagan favorite and founding father of the Mujahideen, Burhanuddin Rabbani, and the aforementioned Hekmatyar. The two did battle into the 90s, laying further waste to the already ravished country. Rabbani eventually won out, but our Saudi and Pakistani allies favored a lesser-known group of religious zealots who were students of the Saudi-funded Salafi Wahhabist religious schools of northwestern Pakistan. Salafi Wahhabism being the ultra-violent interpretation of Islam preferred by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. This preferred group, of course, was the Taliban, and soon Washington followed suit, okaying a proposed plan to replace the Rabbani government with the Taliban. And with the backing and superior firepower of their new benefactors, the Taliban was easily able to take Kabul in 1996, officially ushering in the first iteration of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. By this point, Bill Clinton was president, and our main concern for the country was how soon Unocal could build their pipeline. Never mind the fact that women were now forbidden from attending school and forced to cover themselves from head to toe. Music was also banned, and soccer stadiums were now the scene of public executions of suspected homosexuals and other perceived violators of religious law. And possibly worst of all, an entire generation was being indoctrinated with the most extreme interpretation of Islam in existence, transforming the once vibrant and modernizing country of Afghanistan into a backwards and repressive theocracy similar to Saudi Arabia. Something the State Department was actually hopeful for. Things couldn't be better as far as the United States was concerned, at least not until 9/11. Not that Afghanistan had much to do with 9/11, mind you. It is well known that 15 out of the 19 hijackers, as well as Osama bin Laden himself, were from Saudi Arabia, not Afghanistan. Yes, bin Laden was in Afghanistan prior to and just after 9/11, but that's only because the United States made it the #1 safe haven for Muslim extremists in the world. Muslim extremists, many of which who were on the payroll of various government agencies at some point or another. And if this was really about getting bin Laden, the Bush administration would never have turned down the Taliban's multiple offers to give up the terrorist, and certainly would have chased after him as he fled Tora Bora for the safety of Pakistan in December of 2001. But that would have been way too early and would leave little reason for the invasion of Iraq, who the Bush administration were desperately trying to tie to Al-Qaeda, even though the two were bitter enemies. So instead, the Green Berets were told to stand down, and bin Laden was allowed to freely flee to neighboring Pakistan, where he stayed until it was more politically expedient to kill him, which conveniently turned out to be right before Barack Obama's re-election. The war wasn't about stopping the threat of Al-Qaeda either, who shortly after the invasion had largely dispersed to places such as Iraq, parts of Africa, and eventually Syria. which conveniently gave the U.S. a ready-made excuse to invade those parts of the world as well. But by the time of Obama's enormous and disastrous troop surge in 2010, according to his own national security advisor and former general James Jones, Al-Qaeda had less than 100 members left in the country, meaning for every single member of Al-Qaeda, there was over 1,000 American troops.
All right, the goal to defeat Al-Qaeda. This is what you told our John King on October 4th on his show State of the Union. Listen to this.
The good news that Americans should feel at least good about in Afghanistan is that the Al-Qaeda presence is very diminished. The maximum estimate is less than 100 operating in the country, no bases, no ability to launch attacks on either us or our allies.
All right, less than 100 Al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan, and the United States needs 100,000 troops to fight less than 100 Al-Qaeda operatives?
Damn, you know your argument shit when even Wolf Blitzer pushes back on it. So yes, we did succeed in clearing most of Afghanistan of Al-Qaeda, but ultimately all it did was give them a huge boost in recruitment and force them to evolve to become even more deadly. In the 6 years following 9/11, they would go on to commit more terror attacks than in the 6 years prior. And one key difference between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban that should be noted is that it's Al-Qaeda that has the global aspirations, not the Taliban. So to recap, the Afghan invasion and subsequent occupation wasn't about capturing bin Laden nor eradicating Al-Qaeda. If it were, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia's roles in the attacks, as well as in the systematic spread of the favored interpretation of Islam by radical extremists, would not have been so thoroughly ignored. But they are our allies and were doing nothing U.S. intelligence officials were unaware of. It wasn't even about crushing the Taliban, who actually offered to surrender way back in 2001. But the Bush administration refused to even entertain the offer. So instead, after 20 long years of bloody conflict, the Taliban are now stronger, richer, and better equipped than ever before. And the war certainly was not about helping the people of Afghanistan, who have suffered immensely under American occupation. I could do a whole series of videos on the war crimes committed by our servicemen, our allies, and the Afghanis we have aligned with. But for a couple lowlights, our soldiers were literally ordered to ignore the systematic rape of young boys. In at least one instance, the young children could be heard screaming by our soldiers. And they could be heard because the abuse was actually taking place on one of our military bases. The practice is so widespread that it actually has a specific name, Bacha Bazi, meaning boy play, where young prepubescent boys are made to dress up as girls to entertain certain warlords and other Afghani officials that we were propping up. At least one special forces captain could not stand by idly, even though he was ordered to do so, and actually assaulted one of the militia commanders, after he proudly admitted to keeping a boy chained to his bed as a sex slave. Swift action was indeed taken, and Captain Quinn was relieved of his leadership role and quickly pulled from Afghanistan. After all, the Americans were only trying to maintain good relations with the upstanding people of the Afghan police and the militia units we had allied with. Then there's the multiple kill teams that ran around the Afghan countryside killing for fun and doing things like collecting fingers for trophies. And not just American soldiers either, a crew of Australian troops got in on the action as well, killing dozens of civilians and forcing new members to kill defenseless prisoners as practice in a process known as blooding, which reminds me a whole lot of the brutal gangs operating out of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Please Google LASD gangs if you do not know what I'm talking about. I was going to end part 1 here, but I would be remiss if I did not mention the suicide bomb that killed 13 American soldiers as well as upwards of 170 Afghanis, including 20-year-old Riley McCullum, who was only 8 months old when this war began, which is certainly a tragedy, but something that hasn't gotten a lot of coverage is the disturbing claims that many of the Afghanis killed did not die from the ISIS-K suicide bomber, but by frantic American forces freely firing into the crowd.
Many of those we meet say their relatives weren't killed in the blast, but by firing in the confusion afterwards. They believe by foreign soldiers.
Somehow I saw the American soldier, and beside this there were Turkish soldiers. So the fire come from the bridges, like the towers.
From the soldiers?
Yeah, from the soldiers.
America's Department of Defense didn't reply to our request for comment. The suicide bombing, claimed by the Islamic State group, would have ripped through the densely packed crowd, causing panic. So many of the victims, those who had worked with the international community. Nur Mohammed had been employed alongside American forces.
The guy has served U.S. Army for years, and the reason he lost his life. He wasn't killed by Taliban, he wasn't killed by ISIS. U.S. Army started shelling.
How can you be sure?
Because of the bullet. The bullet went inside of his head, next to right here, near to his ear. He doesn't have any injury.
These are Nur Mohammed's 8 children. He had hoped to give them a better life. Instead, this afternoon, they said a final goodbye.
Whatever the case, Biden wasted little time in vowing revenge for the 13 service members killed. And within 24 hours, the Pentagon successfully carried out a precision drone strike on the ISIS members responsible, or so we were led to believe. But once reporters were able to get on the ground to investigate, they found that the targets taken out were actually a family of 10, 7 of which being children, including a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 2-year-old. But of course, killing civilians with drone strikes is certainly nothing new. Thanks to the brave whistleblower Daniel Hale, we know that under the Obama administration, the U.S. drone program had a civilian casualty rate of 90%, meaning 9 out of every 10 targets killed by American drones were civilians, according to the Pentagon's own numbers. But instead of locking up members of the Obama administration or the Pentagon, it's Daniel Hale who now languishes in the brutal and inhumane U.S. prison system. And as far as the terror attacks committed by Islamic extremists, they have only increased since the start of the infamous war on terror. Which all begs the question, if we were not in Afghanistan to get Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban is now stronger than ever while terror attacks have drastically increased, what was it all for? Well, that's what we'll be discussing in part 2, where we'll take a look at the real reasons we had for occupying the country for so long. Like the long sought-after pipeline, the rare earth minerals, the opium, and perhaps most importantly, the profit made off of the military-industrial complex, which saw no less than $2.2 trillion go from the public sector to the private over the 20-year period. Or to put it another way, roughly $300 million a day that could have been better spent on student debt and rental forgiveness, housing the homeless, education, infrastructure, and other sorely needed and long neglected programs here back home. And I would include healthcare, but that in of itself would save us trillions according to every study conducted, including the Koch brothers funded one, but I digress. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share if you find this information as enlightening as I do. Jana.
So the argument now against withdrawal from pundits in the Beltway is that one of them is that we're abandoning the gains that the U.S. made for women in Afghanistan. How do you respond to that?
You know, I take that seriously in the sense that I do think that we have, you know, some sort of obligation. People who work for us. I take it seriously from an empathetic and like ethical standpoint. I mean, just personally, there were some women in urban centers who were better off. There were some, you know, Democrats, you know, sort of like, you know, liberals in the classic sense. What I question is really 2 things. One, and this seems important, I reject the idea that the United States could meaningfully alter their society in the long term, that any of the gains could have been sustained long term, so long as the kind of underpinning corruption of the whole enterprise and hopelessness of it. Only an American exceptionalist country, right? I mean, and that's almost like clinically insane behavior to even say that, right? If a human being says that I'm an exceptionalist, I mean, I'm a comfortable person. I mean, I'm the arsenal of good in the world. I mean, if they said that, if I'm the last best hope for my family and this town, you put that person away. But when a country does, well, that's patriotism, it's just Americanism. Get on board, chief. Yeah. But the thing is, that's not why we went in the first place. So first of all, our goals were outsized. You know, the Afghan study group says, well, keep 4,000 there. Actually, it'd be even better if you put 8,000 there. And also, we all work for Raytheon and Lockheed, which is true essentially. Someone needs to explain what 8,000 soldiers could do that 100,000 couldn't. The thing is, they can stave off total defeat, but this was an unsustainable enterprise. And then the second one is they just don't know anything about history or motives. you know, and some of them do know, and they're evil, and they're dissembling, and some of them really just don't pay attention all that much, despite having a column at the Washington Post, a regular one, I mean. If you look at the American history in Afghanistan, it is exceedingly clear that this was never about human rights. And there's really 3 periods to look at. See, when folks talk about this, they get to decide where they start the clock. That's what the elites get to do in Washington. You know, sequence and start point matters when you make an argument. And I think that they're just really disingenuous. If you start last week, you can say, look what these horrible things that are happening to like the women and the people who are clinging to the planes. See, America was doing good in the world in Afghanistan. If you start in 1979 and you look at the period from 79 to 89, when the United States is backing the Mujahideen in order to give the Soviets, quote, their Vietnam, when we actually start funding those elements before the Soviets come in order to try to goad them in, which that came out sort of later, and the elements that we were backing, look, I wouldn't support a Soviet invasion anywhere. I just don't like invasions. I'm just kind of like, I'm with the Nuremberg principles on that one, like, which I feel really good about. I feel confident in their company. But obviously the United States doesn't. But with the Soviet Union, it's not that they, you know, should have invaded, should have occupied. But the point is we backed a lot of the most reactionary Islamist elements that later coalesced into things that are like the Taliban. And then some of them actually do end up in the Taliban. They weren't so great on women's rights. I mean, there are accounts of CIA officers being there when like executions were happening and rapes and all kinds of stuff. We were dealing with some dirty folks. And then if we really cared so much about women, especially and human rights, I heard that from like 98 to 2001, there were lots of executions by the Taliban. I mean, it was absolutely brutal. And before September 11th, I mean, on September 10th, the Taliban was awful to women. You know, and it was really hard to be like a liberal or homosexual or anything like that in Afghanistan. I didn't see any calls for invasion. You know, we didn't do that on human rights. And then finally, once we do go in, and even when we move the goalposts and say, actually, we're going to do a little nation building. The reason we're here isn't because we forget about bin Laden. He's not important, even though I said we weren't going to get him dead or alive 3 months ago. He's not important. What we're really here for, so they did the same thing in Iraq, is to make this a better place, to support the Democrats, support human rights. But even then, just at my level, the people we were working with, the local Afghans who were working for the Kabul government, they were only a little bit better, if at all, than the Taliban on those same human rights issues. The captain who was attached to me, my counterpart, Afghan army, he abused his own soldiers and prisoners, caught him in the act. The one time I was walking through a poppy field, the biggest, the most beautiful one I've ever seen, massive opium field. I made a comment to the elder next to me who was also talking to the Taliban, I'm certain, although he was a pretty benevolent two-timer, and I don't blame him. But what I said to him was, I better tell the colonel about this one because I don't know what the policy is right now. You know, it's changed sometimes. Should I burn it? But I'll at least report it. And he said, through the interpreter, he laughed with his belly at me. And he said, you can't burn this field. This is Shafi Khan's opium field. Who's Shafi Khan? He was the police captain from my district that my colonel took pictures with and took with him everywhere. That was his partner. And then also there was the child rape culture, which I, witnessed. And essentially the policy of the U.S. government or the U.S. military was, don't say anything about that rape stuff. Don't say anything about the child buggery, because if you do, you'll alienate the elders tactically. So that none of that sounds exactly like the motive was human rights. We were there to fight a war. We were there to invade, conquer, occupy, and pacify. So I just think it's just totally disingenuous, and I get pretty hyped up when I see those arguments, obviously.
Yeah. If I can add in, to give some details to what Danny is saying, under the government, 4 out of 5 women, as many as 4 out of 5 women are forcibly married, many of them as child brides, where men can legally rape their wives, where the majority of women who are in Afghan prisons are not in those prisons because of moral crime, because of supporting the Taliban, but because of moral crimes. And just to make sure everyone understands what moral crimes means that if you are a woman and you are raped, you are the one put in jail. That is the reality of the Afghan government that we have kept in power, and supported up until this past week. And so the notion that Danny said that so much of our discussion starts on a select date, and that is able to exclude all the antecedents that lead us to this date, as well as to what was actually occurring there. The drugs are a great point Danny makes about the drugs. When I was there, the governor of Kandahar was the president's brother, and he was the largest drug lord in Afghanistan. Mohammed Amin-Noor, who just fled Afghanistan a week or so ago, was the largest drug lord in northern Afghanistan, and he was on our payroll. Gul Olga Sherzai was the biggest drug lord in the east, governor of Nangarhar province, and on our payroll. You know, Akhundzada, this like a wannabe BFF with Hamid Karzai. New York Times reporter goes into her house, opens the wrong door, and finds like 20 tons of heroin there. Biggest drug lord in Helmand province, where hundreds of Americans and British soldiers and Marines died, supposedly to stamp out the drug trade. Drug trade is actually run by our allies in Afghanistan.